the programming instruments, I would say that there is no specific public works programming instruments in the Portuguese law. The provisional instruments I have referred here are the general instruments that any municipality should use. Municipalities have mainly two bodies, the Municipal Assembly, which is the local parliament, and the Municipal Council, which is the executive body of the municipality. The planning options and the budgets are, of course, approved by the Assembly, and the activities plan is defined by the executive body. The only instrument that can be pointed as specific are, in fact, the planning instruments. Like Paolo Urbani mentioned minutes ago, planning instruments have the obligation to define urbanization and infrastructure works, both primary and secondary. So, in a way, they do have to program most of the local authorities' public works. The main problem is that the procedure to adopt or to revise a plan in Portugal is quite bureaucratic, and what this means is that most plans are really outdated and take too long to be revised, and in fact the reality is faster than the procedure, and most of the programming is not in fact done by the plans, but they are determined by reality more than the plans itself. The expropriation procedures are, I would say, the ones that are common to most European countries. They have a Napoleonic standard of the expropriation. The main aspect is that in that procedure, all the expropriations in principle are dependent from the government, in the sense that you have to have a previous declaration of public interest by a member of government to carry out an expropriation. The only alternative to that is that if you have a plan approved, but it must be a detailed plan, not just a general municipal plan, the public declaration can be determined by the local authorities, and they don't need government to do it. So that's the only difference. But apart from that, the procedure is more or less what I would expect the procedure is in the Italian law as well. The main problem, of course, with the expropriation is the financial problem. The Constitutional Tribunal has defined that fair compensation means market value, and that means that the protection that the Constitutional Court is giving in expropriation matters tends to rise the value of the compensations a lot. And it's true, like Paolo said, that the alternatives are being sought. Most of the land needed for public works are obtained through land compensation instruments, especially used in development procedures, meaning that the land is freely given by the companies interested in development. And also land readjustment, la perequazione, is also used in some municipalities at least. And very recently, we have passed an urban renewal law that also creates an alternative. In fact, it goes back to history to restore what we used to call compulsory sale, and it's different from the expropriation mainly because what happens is that the owner is forced to sell to another private owner on a public auction as long as the new owner assumes the obligation to rehabilitate the building. Of course, this is a very specific instrument used in urban renewals areas only and cannot be used everywhere. Well, very briefly, I would say that there's no real speciality in Portugal when we talk about the realization of the public works, mainly because they are mostly done through a contractor, and as in most of the countries that we have heard today, Portugal is a member of the European Union, so our procurement law is basically the transposition of the EU directives. In fact, we have a public contracts code that has been passed 2 years ago to ensure the transposition of both directives 17 and 18, 2004. The only difference is that the code has, in fact, two main chapters. The first one is for procurement, and that's mainly the transposition of the directives. The second part of the code is, in fact, national law, and it's mainly special administrative contracts and their regime of execution. And there we find the public works contract, which is, in fact, regulated by internal laws. The main question is that, according to the directives and the European Court of Justice, the concept of contracting authorities is very broad, and that means that all of the possible alternatives are subject to the Public Works Code. I would point just those issues as the most controversial issues in the jurisprudence. The first one is related to the fact that we still do not have in Portugal a procedure to decide to do a public work that is prior to any other procedures like expropriation or contracting procedures. And what this means is that it's sometimes very difficult to do planning and environmental control of those decisions prior to other procedures that, in principle, assumes that the public work will be done. And what happens is that litigation on planning and environmental issues are almost always focused on the expropriation procedure or on the tender procedures, mainly because we didn't have a chance to discuss those issues before. So the only way to dispute a decision of doing a work is, in fact, to try to dispute its contracting, although in principle, when you open a tender to choose a contractor, you have already decided that you will do the work. So to understand if the work is conform with the planning and environmental issues should be or should have been decided long before. Well, the other two issues are, normal public works contracts issues. The first one is that the recent public contracts code have changed the regime on errors and omissions on the project, and meaning that the contractor is obliged to identify the errors and omissions in the proposal, otherwise he won't be able to claim to the authorities any liability for errors and omissions, except if he proves, and it's very difficult to do it, that he had no way to identify the error or the omission before. And that creates a difficult problem for contractors. The second problem is that cost control regulations are very strict at this time, and the limit of 5% that is now in force is almost impossible to achieve, and that means that the public works market is a little bit shaken by the new regulations, and I'm not sure if they will not have to be revised. There are no really unconventional modes because, as I said, the concept of contracting authority is very broad. But in fact, some municipalities choose to do their main work through municipal corporations, although according to the Public Contracts Code, they are also submitted to the same regulations. There's no specific regulation for public-private partnerships, for local public-private partnerships. And mainly what they do is that they use, if they're contractor partnerships, they use the concession contract that is regulated in the Public Contracts Code. If they're institutional partnerships, what they use is mixed economy companies. But in both cases, there is no really any specialty. There is the issue of the private execution of public works, and I would say that that's what it's most used by the Portuguese municipalities, is to ask developers to do the necessary private work, not only the primary, but also the secondary urbanization works. We do have a problem with the Scala Court of Justice decision because our financial state court is being now very strict in the sense that it is not allowing anymore that public works are transferred to private developers without a tender, without a gara. So sometimes it can be done, but in most cases, what they are saying is that they have to submit to the public works contract according to the Public Contracts Code. The only difference is that in some cases, they are allowing that the developer itself should be the contracting authority. So the result is a kind of a private tender and not really a public tender in the sense of the code. Well, I won't enter into details on inspection and testing. There's not really any speciality. The only issue that is worth mentioning is that the recent regulations have extended the warranty period to 10 years, which is also very hard on contractors because they stay dependent for life, I would say, to the contracting authority. And finally, in respect of arbitration and litigation, I would say that since 2004, when the Administrative Courts Procedure Code have generally allowed arbitration in administrative matters, although with some limitations, arbitration is in fact, I would say, a standard because well, Portuguese courts, they function more or less like Italian courts. So I think you understand that this means that for the market it's impossible to submit to a court. So I would say that 95% of the public works contracts do establish arbitration as the way to resolve disputes. Although it's not mandatory, it's always voluntary,